My name is Daniel. I am an Israelite. I come from a well-respected family who taught me to honor the Lord God. Unfortunately, the kings and priests of Israel have turned their backs on God and done evil in His sight. Nothing has gone well since. The Babylonians have invaded our country and turned our lives upside down. They have destroyed our homes and our land. God's temple has been burned to the ground. Our people have been taken captive to Babylon by the ruthless king Nebuchadnezzar. He has torn us from our families. Even my name has been changed. I have nothing left. My home is now a place I can only dream about. I am stuck in a strange and terrible land where I will probably spend the rest of my life. Without God, I would lose all hope.
Good morning, everybody. It's great to have you here today, whether you're joining us on one of our 3 campuses, Clark Summit, Wilkes-Barre, or Dixon City, or even if you're joining us online, great to have you here as we continue this series called When in Babylon. And during this series, we're just walking through the story of Daniel in the Bible. And I love the story of Daniel and his friends. Man, it's such a powerful story of these young men, teenage men, who were torn away from family and friends and everything familiar to them. And then they were marched 700 miles away to the city of Babylon, where they were held as captives. And they found themselves in this foreign land and in a place that was so opposed to their faith and their values. And yet in that place, they not only survived, they thrived spiritually. And so our hope and our prayer during this series is that we'll learn some things from the story of Daniel and his friends that will help us to thrive in our culture, in our Babylon. And today, as we continue this series, and as I introduce this teaching, I thought I would introduce it by telling you about a brand new app that's coming out for your phone. It's called Got This Thing. And it's very, very interesting. What this app will do is it will fill your calendar with a whole bunch of fake appointments to make you look either really important or really busy. So here's how it would work. Let's suppose you have a friend who wants to know if you can help them move from one apartment to another this weekend. And you could help, but you really don't want to. And so what you do is you push this button on your phone that says Get Busy, and what it does is it fills your calendar on your phone with all kinds of events. And these are actual events that are happening right there in your community. And so what happens is your calendar, it goes from looking like this to looking like this. And so you just show your friend your phone and you say, I'm really overbooked. I'd love to help you on Saturday when you move all your furniture, but I've got this thing I'm doing. And then after you walk away from that conversation, what you do is you push this other button and it kind of clears your calendar back to where it was. Kind of an interesting app, isn't it? It's called Got This Thing. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, okay, don't get your phone out and start downloading it now, because actually it isn't out yet. It's still in development. Because, I know some of you, you're going to go home today, and that's probably the one thing you're going to remember, like from this whole message. I got to get that app, okay? But the reason I mention that is because when I read the story about that, I thought, man, that is such an accurate picture of the way so many Christians in our culture live today. It's almost like we push some kind of a button and we become somebody different when the pressure is on. Like we live one way when we're at church or when we're around our friends who share our faith and our values. But then something happens and, we live a different way when we're at school or when we're at work or we're, surfing the internet by ourselves. Or we come to that moment where we realize that, following Christ is going to cost us something. And so we come to that moment of decision and we kind of switch off our faith and we say, God, I'd love to do what you're calling me to do, but I just can't do it. And, I just think we have this tendency in our culture as Christians to have this faith that kind of goes back and forth depending on what kind of environment that we're in. And I was wrestling with this and I was thinking about this tendency during the week and trying to figure out, what is really at the root of this? What drives that kind of thing? And I think for me, it all comes down to this. I think it all comes down to fear. I think whenever God calls us to take a step of faith, whenever He's calling us to move in His direction, whenever God is calling us to do something that just might go against the flow of culture, the emotion that rises up in our hearts is fear. We fear what we might lose. We fear what other people might think. We fear what that decision might mean for our future, our career, for our reputation, whatever it might be. And some of you know what I'm talking about because you're kind of wrestling with this right now. Maybe in your place of work, you've got a boss who's encouraging you to do something that is clearly unethical. But you want to do the right thing. But every time you think about doing the right thing, what rises up within you is fear. You fear what the consequences might be. You fear what that may cost you if you do what you know you ought to do. Or maybe you're in a dating relationship and that person you're dating is really not the right person for you. And deep down inside, you kind of know it. And everybody who knows you well, they're telling you, get out, get out, get out, because that person's not where they ought to be spiritually and they're not a good fit for you. But you're afraid. You're afraid that if you walk away from that relationship, there may not be another one that comes along. And so fear keeps you from doing what you know you ought to do. Maybe for some of you, it's God is calling you to take a next step in your spiritual journey, to take it to the next level. And for some of you, that simple next step is baptism. Baptism is where we declare openly our faith in Christ and we really cement that decision in our hearts. And I mention that because that next step is coming up in just a few weeks. And maybe you know that that's a next step spiritually that you ought to take, but when you think about it, you're a little bit afraid. It's like, what will people think, and what will my family think, and things like that. And I think for every single one of us, we come to these defining moments in life where the voice of God is speaking to us and the voice of culture is speaking to us at the same time. And we've got to decide, will I do what God is calling me to do? Or will I give in to my fear and try to maintain a life that is comfortable and predictable and safe, even if it means compromising my walk with God and my faith? Now, if I could boil all that down, if I could boil down everything I want to say in these next few minutes, if I could just boil down the real message of chapter 3 in the book of Daniel, which is where we are today, I would say it this way: either fear or faith will determine your future. It's going to be one of those two things. Either your fear or your faith will write your future story, will determine your future. And see, here's what we think. We think the opposite of faith is doubt. I don't think that's true. I think the opposite of faith is fear. I think fear is the greatest enemy to an authentic, risk-taking, God-following faith. So we're going to talk about this idea. Let's pick up in Daniel chapter 3. We're in the third chapter today of Daniel's story. If you have a Bible, you can open it to Daniel chapter 3 if you want to, or you can bring that up on a Bible app on your phone. Let me also encourage you to take out that connection card. Great spot to take some notes right there, things you may want to remember throughout this next week and think about. Let me give you the context. Let me give you the background for this part of the Bible. The story of Daniel, it takes place about 2,600 years ago when the Babylonian Empire was large and in charge. They were the superpower of the world in that day. And the capital city of the empire was the city of Babylon. This is a Google Maps image of the ruins of ancient Babylon. This is about 52 miles south of the city of Baghdad. Okay, so this is where the story of Daniel unfolded 2,600 years ago. This is where it all played out. Now, let me tell you what was happening at that point in history. Here's the background. In 605 BC, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar invaded the city of Jerusalem and took hundreds of Jewish people back to the city of Babylon. Among the exiles from Jerusalem were 4 young men who were brought to the royal palace and trained to serve as advisors to the king. Their names were Daniel. Then these 3 guys that we're going to talk about today, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, also known by their Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So what Nebuchadnezzar did, and he didn't just do this with Jewish people, he did this with many, many different nationalities and people from all parts of the world. He would bring the best and brightest and the smartest and the top of the class to the city of Babylon because he wanted to create a culture there that was superior to any other culture. But then eventually what happens is this. One day Nebuchadnezzar decides that what all these different people from different places need is they need unity. They need something to kind of give them a common focus. And at the same time, he needed to do something to remind them that their ultimate authority in life was him, King Nebuchadnezzar. So here's what he does. Verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 90 feet high and 9 feet wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. So he makes this very expensive gold image, and we don't know what the image was. The Bible doesn't tell us. Some people think it may have had a likeness of Nebuchadnezzar himself because he was so arrogant. I tend to think it was probably the image of the god, the Babylonian god that he was named after, Nabu, which was the Babylonian god of wisdom and literature. And there are actually a number of smaller statues of this Babylonian god that archaeologists have found all throughout that area, including this one, which is made of stone. It's 15 feet tall, and it's in the National Museum of Iraq in Baghdad. So it may have been this. We don't know exactly what it was, but he creates this huge gold image of some kind. And then here's what he does, verse 2. He then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So he sends out messengers all over the empire, and he invites all the officials to come in for this really big dedication ceremony of this very expensive image that he had created. And once everybody's there, once everybody's gathered together, here's what happens, verse 4. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "This is what you were commanded to do, O peoples, nations, and men of every language. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up." And then, just in case somebody wasn't really interested in participating, he added a little bit of incentive. Verse 6. He said, "Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." And let me tell you what, that creates a very engaged group of people right there. See, they had these furnaces in that part of the world in that time in history that were very large, and they would typically be used to make bricks because the entire city of Babylon was made of these bricks that they constructed. And this is a pair of furnaces for brick making that were discovered in that part of the world. And they would have an entrance here, and then also one on top where the smoke could get out, and they could create a tremendous amount of draft for very hot fire because they had to bake those bricks at about 1,000 degrees. Okay. So everybody who showed up in Babylon that day for the big dedication ceremony, I don't think this was a very difficult decision for them. It's like, okay, let me see here. I can either bow down and worship the big expensive gold statue, or I can burn to death. Let me think about it. Yep, that's a no-brainer. I think I'll worship. Everybody, that is, except for a few people, because there were these 3 young Jewish men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Those were the Babylonian names that were given to them. And even though they were living in Babylon, they lived by the laws of God. They were very devout in their Jewish faith, including God's laws that were included in the 10 Commandments. And the very first of the 10 Commandments, you shall have no other gods before me. The second of the 10 Commandments, you shall not bow down to any idols or any graven images, as it sometimes says in the Bible. So these guys had a very, very difficult decision to make. And the decision was this: would they cling to their faith in the face of their fear, or would they give in to their fear just to go along and survive? Would that dictate their decision? Now I want to point something out here that's very, very important. I want to point out that Daniel and his 3 friends, they did not resist every decision made by the Babylonian government, okay? They did not protest, they did not boycott, they didn't write up these diatribes and post them on their Facebook pages about how bad the Babylonian government was. See, they understood something. They understood that they should not expect people in a pagan empire to act like believers. And so for the most part, Daniel and his friends, they worked hard, they respected the authority in their lives, they did their jobs well, they earned the respect of other people, they earned the trust of other people, and over time, they gradually had a very positive influence. But this was different. This was different because here they were being asked to do something that was in direct violation of their faith. Now let's be honest, okay? It would have been really easy to just do what Nebuchadnezzar wanted them to do and just rationalize it. It would have been easy for me, I know that, because I would have been there and I would have thought, you know what? I'm here to be an influence for God. I'm here in Babylon to make a difference. And you know what? I can't do that if I'm dead. And I think God would understand. He would know that I'm just kind of bowing on the outside, but I don't really mean it on the inside. So I think God would be okay with this. And it would be so easy to rationalize this decision, especially with what was at stake, which was your very life, and not a pleasant way of losing your life. So it would have been so easy, I think, in that context, to switch from faith to fear. But these guys don't do that. They set aside the fear and they stepped forward in faith, and instead of bowing down, they stayed standing up. Well, you know what happened, don't you? Eventually, Nebuchadnezzar finds out about this because other people tell him. And he is not very happy that these three Jewish men did not bow down to his very expensive statue. So here's what happens, verse 13. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound," he goes through the whole list again, "of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I have made, well, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace." So he calls these guys in. He says, "Listen, guys, I like you. I really do. So I'm going to do you a favor. I'm going to assume that the instructions I gave before were not as clear as they should have been. And I'm going to assume that you did not really understand what I meant and what I had in mind and what I was envisioning here today. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to give you another chance. We're going to get the whole orchestra together, and I'm going to have them strike up the band and play the tune one more time. And you're going to get the opportunity to redeem yourselves. And you can bow down and worship the image I've set up. But if you don't do it, I will have no other choice but to follow through on the threat that I've made." And then he adds this sentence, "Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand." And that is so arrogant, isn't it? And by the way, that's not like a literal question. That's just one of those questions that people ask when they don't really expect an answer. It's like what they call a rhetorical question. A rhetorical question is when you ask it, but you know what the answer is and you don't expect an answer. Like parents do this all the time. My mom used to do this. She would say things like, "Do you want a spanking?" That was a rhetorical question, not meant to be answered. Or, "Do I look stupid?" Rhetorical question, not meant to be answered. I think he meant this to be a rhetorical question, but these guys actually answered it. Verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him. They said, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter." They're not argumentative. They're not defensive. They're basically saying, listen, King, we're not interested in getting into a big debate with you. We're not interested in an argument. We didn't even want to put you in this position. We just can't do this. And then they go on to say this, verse 17. "If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king." I mean, they're still respectful. Even though they're being threatened with death by burning, they're still respectful toward him. But what they say next, and you got to catch this, this is so amazing. This is such a profound statement of faith. You can't miss this. Verse 18, here's what they say. "But even if he does not," that is a key phrase. In fact, I want you to say those 6 words with me together on every single campus. This isn't all play. We won't throw you in a blazing furnace if you don't do it, but this isn't all play. Okay, here we go. 1, 2, 3. "But even if he does not." One more time, because Wilkes-Barre wasn't really doing that very well. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. "But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." Do you hear what these guys are saying? They're saying, "Listen, King Nebuchadnezzar, we respect you and all that. But listen, our God is able to save us. We know what he can do. We don't know what he will do. But we will not bow down and worship your image, even if we have to die. We will only worship the one who is worthy of our worship, and that is the God in heaven, the God who can do what we just described, even if we don't know if he will do it, even if he does not. We're just going to worship him, even if it costs us our lives. And there's such a powerful principle here in this that I think we need to remember. And the principle is this: just because God can do something doesn't mean he must do it. Just because God is able to do something doesn't mean he's obligated to do something. And we just need to understand that, friends. Otherwise, we become so disappointed. And sometimes our faith in God, sometimes our love for God is so conditional. We love God or we trust in God, not because of who he is, but because of what we think he's going to do for us. And when he doesn't come through, then our faith and our love kind of evaporate. It's kind of like a story I think I've told you before, but if you've been around here for a while, you know that one of my pet peeves as a parent when we were raising our daughters, one of my pet peeves was Barbie dolls. Like, I never let my kids have Barbie dolls. And just kind of my thing. And my daughter Leah, she was kind of little, and we were at a store one day and doing some shopping, and she saw a Barbie doll, and she wanted a Barbie doll, and she even had some birthday money that she was going to buy it with. And she says, Daddy, can I have a Barbie doll? And I said, no, honey, you can't have a Barbie doll. And she said, Daddy, why not? And I said, well, honey, you can't have a Barbie doll because Barbie dolls promote narcissism, because they overemphasize external beauty at the expense of internal character. And I don't want you to grow up thinking that way. So no, you can't have a Barbie doll. And she, starts crying a little bit, and she kept asking, and I kept saying no, and I kept saying no. And finally she played her trump card. And finally she said this. She said, okay. She said, okay, Daddy, but if you won't get me a Barbie doll, then you can't be my daddy anymore. Sometimes we respond to our Heavenly Father like that, don't we? There are those times when I don't get the promotion, and I don't get the job. I don't get the answered prayer. I don't get the success or the health that I was looking for. And in those times, I have to ask myself, do I love God for who he is, or do I love God for what he does for me? In those times, I have to ask myself, can I trust God simply because he is worthy of my trust, or do I only trust him when I feel like he's coming through for me? Because that isn't really trusting God, it's trusting in my agenda for God. And just because God can do something doesn't mean that he must. Just because he's able doesn't mean that he's obligated. And I love the faith of these guys. It is so deep and so profound. And it honestly puts me to shame sometimes, because my faith sometimes is so conditional and so superficial. But they say, even if God does not come through for us, we will not worship you. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, he was not impressed with the faith of these three guys. Here's what happens, verse 19. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. No more Mr. Nice Guy. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the furnace. Now, you read this and you just see how angry this guy is, because he isn't even thinking rationally. He isn't even thinking clearly. Like, he orders the furnace heated 7 times hotter. Why would you bother doing that? I mean, fire is fire, right? That really doesn't make any difference. And all that he ends up doing is killing his own soldiers. Keep reading here in verse 22. The king's command was so urgent. In other words, he's like, do this now. In the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They took them up to the top to throw them in. It killed them. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Now, let me tell you something. This story could have ended right there, and it would still be an awesome story. These guys would have died for their faith. They would have been ushered into eternity, and the Heavenly Father would have said, welcome home, well done, good and faithful servants. I mean, even if the story had ended right there, it'd be a great story, but probably most of you know the story. And it doesn't end there. It has a really different ending, a really kind of cool ending. But I just want to admit something here honestly. That's more the exception than the rule, I think. Not every story in this life has a happy ending. In fact, many times they don't. But here's what you need to understand. If you're a child of God, if you're a follower of Christ, this life is like 1 millisecond on the timeline of eternity. And no matter how your story ends, no matter where your faith may take you, you'll always have a perfect ending, if not in this life, in eternity. But even if the story had ended there, it'd be a great story. But it doesn't end there. Some very interesting things begin to happen at this point. Verse 24. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" And they replied, "Certainly, O king." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." God sent someone to the furnace to be with these guys. And it was either an angel or it was what theologians call a pre-incarnate appearance of the Son of God, which is what I think this was. And you see several of these occurrences all throughout the Old Testament of the Bible. What this was, I believe this was Jesus who existed from eternity past. He wasn't born in Bethlehem. He took on flesh, but he existed before that. This was Jesus stepping into history even before Christmas. And he steps in and stands with these guys and stands with them. And it says this very interesting phrase. It says they're walking around in the fire. And I don't know, I read stories like this and it just gets my imagination going. And I'm wondering, why are they walking around in the fire? And it could have been as simple as this. It could have been, "Oh, hey, welcome. My name's Shadrach. These are my friends over here, Meshach and Abednego. Hey, come on over, guys. Don't be shy. Introduce yourselves. And what's your name? Hey, well, it's great to meet you. So glad you could join us here in our furnace. It just wouldn't be the same without you." I mean, they're just having this conversation. And I don't know what they're walking around and talking about. You mean it's all conjecture. But I wonder if the 4th man in the furnace told the other 3 that the Heavenly Father was proud of their devotion in their faith. I wonder if the 4th man in the furnace told the other 3 that because of their act of faith and courage, their story would be told for generations to come. It would even be put into writing, and people thousands of years later would hear about it. I wonder if the 4th man in the furnace told them that because of their act of faith, countless other believers in the days to come would be encouraged in the midst of their own suffering. I don't know any of that, but I do know this. I know that if they had given into their fear, I know that if they had bowed down to that idol, they would have missed this incredible encounter with the living God. And let me just remind you of something that I was reminded of as I read this story again. And that's this, that even when God doesn't keep us from the fire, He walks with us in the furnace. Because here's the truth, God doesn't always keep us from the fire. He doesn't. And sometimes we end up in the fire, but even when we end up in the fire, I believe God, through His Holy Spirit, walks with us. And you may be walking through a furnace of your own right now. I don't know what that looks like for you, but as you walk through that, I want you to know this. You may encounter God in a way that you never would have encountered Him otherwise. So it's amazing. These guys are in there. They're safe. They're kind of hanging out with the Son of God. And then here's what happens next. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come on out, come here." Now, if I'd been in there, here's what I would have said. I would have said, "Oh, King, we can't hear you. Come a little closer." No, a little closer yet. That's what I would have said, but these guys don't do that because they're better than I am. And here's what it goes on to say. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Incredible miracle. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent His angel and rescued His servants. They trusted in Him and defied the king's command," that'd be me, "and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble. I kind of think that Nebuchadnezzar had some anger management issues. It's like, all right, we're going to burn you all to death. No, we're going to cut you into pieces. It's like he had some issues. But anyway, here's the last sentence in the chapter. Here's what it says. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. I love this story. It's a fascinating story. And I don't know about you, but when I read a story like this, and maybe this is just me, when I read a story like this, there are just all kinds of questions in my mind that kind of bubble up to the surface. Strange questions sometimes. Like, here's one of my questions. I wonder if those guys kept those robes. Really. And I wonder if their wives kept trying to get rid of them because they were getting old and kind of worn out, but they kept them, I bet they did. You know what I bet they did? I'll bet once a year on that date, they all got together, they put on their robes, and they smoked a cigar, and they talked about that night when they defied a king, and they walked in the fire, and they experienced the living God. I'll bet they never forgot that. And here's what I also wonder. I wonder if they ever asked themselves, what if? What if we had bowed down to that idol? What if we had given into our fear? What if we hadn't acted in faith? Just think about what we would have missed. I wonder if they ever asked themselves that, because here's what you need to understand. You never know. You never know what hangs in the balance. You just never know. Here's another question I ask. Why did God let them go through all that? I mean, think about this. God knew that he was going to rescue them eventually, so why didn't he do that just a little bit earlier? Like, why didn't he have them get sick with the flu on the day of the big dedication ceremony? Or why not just blind the eyes of all the other people so no one notices when they don't bow down? I mean, there were all kinds of other options that would have been so much easier on these guys. Because let's face it, even though they survived, man, that had to be pretty traumatic, don't you think? Why put them through all that? And I don't know why, but I do know this. I know one reason. Because that night in Babylon, nobody was talking about the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar had created. Do you know what they were talking about that night in Babylon around the dinner table? They were talking about the God of Israel, who rescued his people from a blazing furnace. See, you never know what's at stake in your obedience. You never know what might hang in the balance. Let me say it one more time. Either fear or faith will determine your future. And you've got to choose. You can choose faith, and that will put you on one path, or you can choose fear, and that will put you on a very different path. One of those two things is going to determine your future. Now, here's the thing. The majority of us won't face a decision that will have life and death consequences, okay? But we all face decisions every single day. And when we hear the voice of God and the voices of our culture, there's going to be a tug of war in your heart between fear and faith. So I don't know what that decision looks like for you. I don't know what that next step looks like for you. But it could be as simple as this. It could be as simple as giving up a job so that you can be in church with your family. That was the decision that Jose and Melinda had to wrestle with. And I want you to hear their story. Jose and Melinda attend our Wilkes-Barre campus, and I want you to hear their story of how they had to wrestle with fear and with faith. Watch this with me.
I attended the first Easter service that they had at the Wilkes-Barre campus, and that was before Jose and I even met. And then I was attending with my children and had stopped, and then once we were dating for a few months, the second Easter service came about and we started attending together, and we've been at the Wilkes-Barre campus ever since.
When Melinda mentioned it, I think I was all for it. We're like, yeah, you know what, let's do this. And that, I don't believe that was an accident. It was like we were both kind of like in that same path where, you know, we were kind of, I guess, maybe searching for whatever may be missing in our lives at that time.
I had lived with my grandmother who passed away, and she was my rock when it came to the kids. Jose and I weren't married yet, we didn't live together. So I had to change jobs. I had to leave one job to go to another job that was more family friendly. But that job required me to work every Saturday, Sunday, Monday. I wasn't able to attend church. In that time, Jose and I got married. He was still attending, the children were still attending, but I couldn't go.
There was a big loss. Like, I took this step with my wife, my fiance at the time, and she wasn't there anymore every week. And that was really, really tough.
Not being able to be there with my family, knowing that my husband and my children were there every Sunday and I was, at work, and not being able to serve. I love family ministry. I feel my heart is in family ministry. And I felt like I was just starting to find my footing in that, and then I had to leave. So it was a loss of community, a loss for my marriage, a loss with my children. So after a few months, we sat down and talked about it, and Jose said to me, if you're that unhappy, don't worry about the money, don't worry about how we're going to make it work with the kids. We'll make it work, we always find a way. There was a lot of hurdles that we had to overcome in order for me to switch jobs to ensure that I could go back to church, and it was scary because we weren't really sure how we would make it work. So I went back to my old boss, and there was a job opening available that would allow me to go to church every Sunday and work day shift while the kids were in school. Once the decision was made, I was at peace, because before that it was very stressful. It's like, I want to leave this job. I know this is what I need to do, but is it really the right choice? And then once we made the choice, it was over. I was at peace. It was like, okay, let's go. What's next?
I think I was throwing up the mask a little bit. Like, I was like, okay, I'm good. And I would go sit with anybody that I knew at church. But when she was really, really back, like, I looked at her and I said, I really missed you.
It felt like I was coming home that first Sunday. Like, we got up, we got ready, we went to church together as a family, took the kids back, and it felt wonderful to be there with my husband and to be able to just sit next to him and hold his hand and listen to the message.
There was a void, and that void has been filled, and it reflects in the rest of the house. The kids are ecstatic. I mean, I was going with them, but they love their mom going with them. It was important for their mom to go with them too. They
love that we can attend church as a family. I think they really missed having me there, because it's a family day for us. We knew we were facing some hurdles, loss of income, childcare, and together we overcame that. We prayed. We both really invested in God and our faith, and that's what got us through, and that's what gets us through a lot of things in our marriage, is praying.
Hey, on every campus, how about if we thank Melinda and Jose for sharing their story? I really appreciate their faith. I appreciate them sharing their story with us. Whenever we come to a defining moment like that, there's going to be a tug of war in our hearts. And either fear or faith is going to win, and it's going to be fear or faith that will determine your future. So what is the decision that you're going to be facing this week or this month or this year? Maybe it's a decision to let go of something that you need to hang on to. Maybe it's a decision to get out of a relationship. Maybe it's a decision to just be honest about who you are and live out your faith authentically and not go back and forth all the time. Maybe it's a decision to take a next step spiritually, or just to get engaged with what God is doing in this world and set aside some time to serve Him and to love your neighbor and to reach out. I don't know what it is that God is calling you to do, but you can respond either with faith or with fear, and that's going to make all the difference, and you don't know what may hang in the balance. And as I was studying this story of Daniel, I couldn't help but think of another famous man of faith in the Bible who lived hundreds of years after Daniel. His name was Peter, one of the apostles, one of the inner circle of the followers of Jesus. And there was this one night when Jesus called Peter to take a step of faith and move away from what was comfortable and familiar with him and to move into the unknown. And it happened in the middle of a storm. You remember the story. The disciples were out in a boat in the middle of this storm, and Jesus comes to them walking on the water. You know, just like he came to Daniel's friends in the middle of a fire, he came to Peter and his friends in the middle of a storm. And when he comes, he speaks to them, and he invites Peter to step away from the comfortable and the familiar and to move in faith. And let me just close by reading this for you. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and beginning to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?"